Welcome to Episode 60, an introduction to suicide risk assessment, a critical overview, featuring Norine VanderHooven, licensed clinical social worker. From Clearly Clinical, learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. Today we are joined by Norine VanderHooven. Norine is a licensed clinical social worker with over 30 years of experience in the field, and she is specialized in suicide prevention and suicidality. She also is EMDR certified and trained in the treatment of trauma, depression, and anxiety, and she serves as the chair of the Youth Suicide Prevention Committee for the American Association of Suicidology. Norine, thank you so much for taking some time to share your expertise with us.
Thanks, Beth. I'm happy to be here.
Norine, tell us a little bit about you and how you acquired this unique and important specialization.
With suicide in particular, I supervised a mobile crisis response team for youth for Ventura County for about 5 years. And when I started working there, I really had no idea to the depth and extent of what suicidality, suicidal ideation, prevention, intervention, postvention, all of it really was. And they had, in 2012, the American Association of Suicidology had their conference in Los Angeles. And it was a perfect opportunity for my boss and I to go. And that was really my introduction. And I learned how much I didn't know and decided that this was so important because this was the high-risk population we were working with. And about 85% of the youth that called from ages, well, the earliest was 3, not the 3-year-old called, but a parent called and we went to assess, up to 20. And about 85% were suicidal ideation or already had made attempts. So, and I've just gotten more involved over time with that.
Thank you again for being here and sharing this expertise with us. We know that so many of us during our careers will be faced, unfortunately, with a client suicide. And I think a lot of us don't necessarily know what signs to look out for and what steps we can be taking to really understand this phenomenon and how we can best help.
Yes, that is true. And it's very frustrating. In schools now, they are starting to do some training, but certainly not a course on it. Maybe they'll do one class on it, which really isn't even enough to touch the surface. It gives you an idea. But I was just reading this morning, actually, on one of the suicidology listservs that between 7 out of 10 and 8 out of 10 people will actually express some desire to somebody and then die by suicide. So suicide is preventable, but we just need to know how to identify it and identify the warning signs.
Tell us a little bit about those warning signs that we should really be paying attention to.
One of the biggest warning signs is, Thomas Joyner, who is out of Florida State University, talks about the interpersonal psychological theory of suicidal ideation and, or suicidal behavior, sorry. And what it is, he talks about 3 things: thwarted belongingness, meaning a person doesn't feel like they belong anywhere, perceived burdensomeness. So if a person feels like they are a burden to somebody, and then the actual capability for suicide. So if you have the first 2, that kind of makes the desire for suicide. And then that third one adds in that perfect storm where the person has already given up. They really just don't care about ending their life. They don't care that they're going to experience pain when they die by suicide. They're over it. And kind of what I talk about is that a lot of people have said, I hear all the time, and it just makes me shiver, is that they say suicide, people who attempt suicide or die by suicide, it's a selfish thing. But really, if you take a paper towel roll and you just look down that paper towel roll, and that's all you see is that little circle right in front of you, that's all those people see. They have no awareness of anything else, anywhere else around them. And so that just kind of tells you the tunnel vision that they really do have.
When talking about these three components, can you give us some examples or an example of what this looks like in practice and how to really focus in on those three factors and how they present in the room?
Yeah, sure. A good example is someone comes into your office and they start talking about how teen, let's say, has no friends, they're very isolated, um, they're constantly bullied. Then on top of that, they feel like they're a burden to their parents. The parents aren't paying attention to them. I have one client who came in last week who told me that she tried to kill herself 5 times in front of her mom, and her mom just didn't even pay attention. So one of the times she took a wire and tried to strangle herself and actually left ligature marks on her neck. And her mom just looked the other way. And so she was over it. It's not that she necessarily, in particular, wanted to die, but she felt like she had nobody to talk to, nobody to turn to, nobody cared for her. She was more of a pain in the neck than she was able to, have support. She didn't feel like anybody loved her. And so therefore, she felt that there was really no purpose for her to live anymore. And so that's, someone could come in very depressed, very flat, not giving you any information. But the minute they start giving those cues of, it's just not worth it, I don't want to be here anymore, you really have to explore what those mean more, because that it's very ambiguous as to what that could mean. It can mean so many different things. But sometimes all they want you to do is just ask them. So Kevin Hines, who wrote a book called Cracked Not Broken, he jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. And he speaks all over the world now. Amazing guy. He just put out a documentary called The Suicide, the Ripple Effect. But what he talked about was when he was ready to jump, all he wanted was someone to come ask him, are you okay? Is anything going on? Can I help you? Anything like that, just to give him the thought that someone cared. And nobody did. He stood there for a long time and nobody did. And so that's when he jumped. And as soon as he jumped, he regretted it. And he had all these, I believe, if I remember correctly, there were sea lions swimming around underneath him, keeping him afloat. And he thought they were sharks or something. But they were keeping him afloat until the Coast Guards came and rescued him. So people really just want to know that they are loved and cared about. And that's just the beginning. It goes so much deeper than that. But a lot of times that's all it takes to stop a person from following through.
That example you give about the paper towel roll, I think, is really interesting and highlighting that tunnel vision. And in the example you gave, all he really wanted to have was awareness that he mattered. He wanted to have connection with somebody and know how he might fit into the larger world. In your field, in your specialization, what are some myths that you find that are prevalent?
So believe it or not, there are so many therapists who think they will never see a suicidal client in their practice. And myth, rumor, any clinician, it's a 1 in 4 chance that you will have a client die by suicide. And that has increased over the last, I would say, 6 or 7 years. It used to be 1 in 7. And psychiatrists are even higher. Psychiatrists are about 1 in 3 dying in their practice. Another myth is that nobody believes that adolescent suicide, a lot of people do not believe that adolescent suicide is as high as it is. And so a lot of people think that, teens, they're just being manipulative, or they're just seeking out attention, or they're doing this for attention. Well, yes, they are. They are crying out for help. And so, it's up to the therapist to help them, spin it in a different way to see, even for adults, why is it that they are crying out for attention and doing this? It's not just that they have some manipulative behavior that they're doing.
You bring up the word manipulative, which is something in clinical practice that we're obviously kind of discouraged from using, discouraged from labeling, I guess I should say. It's something that we certainly sometimes hear from family members that don't understand this behavior and why it's happening. How do we as clinicians help separate what might be suicidal posturing from real, true suicidal behavior and suicide risk when we're looking at it through the lens of perhaps what might be access to pathology and the importance of separating out these two different phenomena?
So sometimes there's not. And any time anyone says anything, right now I work with more adults than I do teens, but I worked with teens for 30 years. So I'm kind of shifting that a bit. But even now I hear adults talk about their spouses sometimes when they're having, struggles. Oh, that's just, manipulative. Well, even if they've made a gesture, they're making a gesture for a reason. So, it really then takes the therapist afterwards to sit down and to assess what is it exactly. Did they do this because they truly wanted to die? They did not want to live anymore. They wanted to go to sleep and they never wanted to wake up again. Or did they do this because they just had so much pain and they wanted their pain to end and they didn't know how to stop their pain? So there are a lot of different reasons for why someone tries to kill themselves. And I guess the niche is to really try and find out what that is so that then you can give them why do they want to live and what do they have, to live for, and give them hope to live. So it's really changing that conversation from why do you want to die to what is it that, we can help you want to live for.
You said that a lot of times it's people wanting to know that they're cared for and that they fit in somewhere. Many of us are trained in our master's or doctoral programs to initiate safety planning when we hear from a client that they may be having suicidal thoughts or any kind of suicidal behaviors from the past. What's the effectiveness of safety planning, and what's been your experience with this treatment method?
It's interesting because safety planning by itself is not very effective. So the other thing that there was just an article it was actually a couple of years ago in the Scientific American that talked about suicide risk assessment isn't very effective. Well, when it comes down to it, it's not really suicide risk assessment that's not effective. It's suicide risk screenings that are not effective. So because what happens is when you screen for suicide, sometimes it's yes or no questions. And sometimes a client maybe isn't going to be honest with a yes or no question, and maybe it's not a yes or no answer. So unless you dive deeper and ask more thorough questions and really ask an in-depth, do an assessment, then you're just not going to know. So once you're able to do that, then you can do a safety plan with that. But I also do a whole rating scale to find out. So from 1 to 5, where are you right now? 1 is no thoughts of suicide. 5 is you have a plan. You are going to follow through with it when you get home today. Where are you? And then I ask them, what does that number mean to them? And then we go through, and I have a rating scale that I've drawn out, or I have them draw out if they want, and list 1 through 5 what each means so that they can help identify for themselves when they're going up or down on that rating scale and when they become more triggered. And then with that, and then with resources that mean something to them, or, everybody goes, oh, well, why don't you just do mindfulness, or why don't you do journaling, or maybe that's not what's going to be helpful for them. There are a gazillion different ways for people to be able to ground themselves or to, calm themselves. And I think a lot of clinicians just aren't aware of the depth and the extent of what those coping skills really are to be able to be helpful to people who are suicidal.
One thing I know that I was trained was to evaluate for the access to means. That can get a little bit nebulous because most of us have access to a car. Most of us have knives in our kitchen. Most, if not all of us, have access to something with which we could complete suicide, whether that's a cord or a rope or food or substances in which we could potentially end our lives. How does the availability of means really fit into the equation when it comes to assessing actual risk for suicide?
Yeah, that's a tough one because especially like with access to means with lethal means with a gun is the number one way of dying by suicide. And so I think it's over 50% or something. And so that's tough because even if you say, okay, well, so give me your gun or, we're going to take it to the police station or whatever we're going to do to secure it. Most people who have guns do have another gun stashed somewhere. So, that makes it tough. You can only do what you can do. Like you said, it's not like you can take away their car. If they're that high of a risk, then they need some other, support. It's not necessarily always hospitalization. Even when I started on the crisis team, it was like, oh, they can't keep themselves safe. We have to hospitalize them. But that's really not it, because there are people who die by suicide in hospitals. When I was on the crisis team, that did happen to one youth at one of the psychiatric hospitals. And here we thought we were keeping this kid safe. But it really then is kind of calling in the troops. You do have to have those supports, or maybe they need a higher level of care for a longer period of time, a more intensive program. It's just not, hospitalization is really for stabilization. It's not treatment at all.
One of the things that I've seen in the research is the difference between our standard procedure when we are encountering clients that might have suicidal ideation or suicidal thoughts, and then what we do clinically to address that or to manage it. Things like psychiatric hospitalizations, I've kind of seen conflicting information about the effectiveness. What's been your experience with the effectiveness of psychiatric hospitalization and also some of the research behind that step of using a psychiatric hospitalization to address a client's suicidal ideation?
I don't know what the actual research itself says, but I will tell you within the American Association of Suicidology, they have a community of lived experience folks. So they're one of our divisions, actually. So just like we have a clinical division and a research division, they are a division. They make up a large portion. And there are people that are very outspoken about that hospitalization did not help them. Hospitalization was actually very harmful to them. They needed other things. So maybe some of them needed, a lot more one-on-one support, direct contact for a greater amount of time, or someone, to have a caregiver be with them. Some people needed a type of, IOP or PHP or even residential program to be able to help them through these things, to learn different skills rather than resorting to trying to kill themselves. But hospitalization, from what I saw when I worked at the crisis team, we had a lot of teens that we would re-hospitalize. And that necessarily did not work until we got them into that higher level of treatment. And part of that problem was, which is all over the country, is number one, those resources aren't enough. And also when the crisis team, it's just really like crisis and referral. That's it. So you don't always have that opportunity. You can just refer them, but it's not your job to follow through on that, which is another broken piece of the system.
When a call has been made to a psychiatric emergency response team, either by you as a clinician or by somebody like a family member, what guidance or advice do you have for clinicians about how they can work alongside a psychiatric emergency response team in order to support improved outcomes of that experience and the potential hospitalization?
Awesome question. I've had that a lot, and both as a clinician in private practice now and both as a supervisor of the crisis team. So really the best way is I always felt helpful is for the clinician to be able to give the crisis team the clearest information that they can about their client, with leaving out all of their biases of what, they think should happen, and really just present the clinical information and what the client is presenting with, because that's what they specialize in. And so they know, or they're supposed to know, what to do to move forward. And not all clinicians specialize in suicide prevention or risk assessment. And that's why you're calling them. So if you are able just to present as much information clearly as you can, then that's the most helpful thing. And then you step out of the way and let them do their job. And if they need to ask you questions, you are present for them to ask questions, but let them do their job.
One thing I've seen is the difficulty working alongside law enforcement. There are some counties or cities that have a response to psychiatric emergencies that includes clinical support, whether that's an emergency social worker or a therapist. And then sometimes it's really just a police officer or a group of law enforcement officers that are responding to a call. What guidance do you have about how we can work alongside law enforcement effectively?
Yeah, it's interesting. So in Ventura County, where we live in California, they have what's called CIT officers. So it's crisis intervention trained officers, and they receive 40 hours of mental health training. And they actually learn how to ask the questions and the correct language to use and how to be sensitive to these clients who are more escalated at times or who are very shut down. Because, when a police officer shows up and the client shut down and won't talk, they think that they're being resistant or that they don't want to answer. And it's not that they don't want to answer, it's that sometimes they can't. So you can be there as an advocate and support your client in a different way than you would with a crisis team. And really to help them get their message across, or whatever their thoughts and feelings are, across to the police officers, because ultimately they're the ones who do have the ability to write the 5150 hold. So as much as you can collaborate and get them on your side, the better for your client.
You hinted at my next question, which relates to language and the actual wording that we use. What language do we need to be using when inquiring about a client's possible suicidality?
The biggest thing that stands out to me just in suicide in general is people say someone committed suicide. And I was actually just reading one of the books that was written in 2011 that says committed suicide. And the language that we've been trying to change that to is died by suicide. Because if you were saying committed by suicide, it's sounding like the person committed a crime or that they did something wrong, and they didn't. They have mental health issues and they could not get through that. They couldn't see anything to get past that. So in asking, the other thing is people ask, so do you want to harm yourself? Well, harming yourself and killing yourself are two different things. So you need to ask directly, have you thought about killing yourself, or have you thought about ending your life? And then you need to ask, have they made an attempt? And, do they ask again about that 1 to 5 scale that we talked about, but use the word died and kill and suicide, not harm yourself.
I saw an article recently that suggested using the phrase thoughts of death when inquiring about suicidality. What are your thoughts on using a phrase like that, or that exact phrase?
I think someone could have thoughts of death and not want to actually kill themselves. So people could have thoughts of death and just want to not be here in this life because they have too much pain. But that doesn't mean that they have any intent or plan or know what they're going to do. So, there's kind of a continuum of starting at the thoughts and then just of death thoughts, and then going to passive suicidal thoughts where someone's thinking about it and actually thinking about suicide, but not having ways. Then there is the actual plan, and someone has its active suicidal ideation where they do have a plan and intent. Then there is when someone makes what's called an aborted attempt, when someone comes, when their attempt is stopped. Someone comes in and finds them, or that's when they stop themselves. The interrupted attempt is someone comes in to stop them. They walk in on them. And then there is the actual suicide attempt, and then someone dies by suicide. So if you're saying thoughts of death, that doesn't really clarify suicide.
If we were to have the hunch in session that someone may be suicidal, How do you actually start that conversation in your sessions?
I'm really blunt about it. And I just ask them. I will just say, you know, it seems like right now you're extremely sad and I'm just really concerned. And I'm wondering if you've had thoughts of wanting to kill yourself.
And what do you do if the person says no, they explicitly deny any plan or means or suicidal thoughts, but your clinical sense, your spidey sense, if you will, is telling you otherwise?
Then I'll usually kind of go around. I'll ask them also, because the other thing is they might not have it at that moment. So they think that they're getting around like a loophole in answering you. And then I'll go back and I'll ask, you know, had they done anything in the past, or when was the last time that they had thoughts of wanting to kill themselves? And then if they continue with no, then I will go to the whole dying and death scenario, and then I'll just have it continue the conversation and bring back up suicide. You know, I'll ask them at what point would they want to do something to kill themselves. And I'll also normalize it in the sense that a lot of people do have thoughts of suicide, but that doesn't mean that they need to be in a hospital. It doesn't mean that they're going to do anything about it. It just means that right now they're in a really, really bad place and they cannot see another way out. And so that's kind of entered their mind. And as soon as you normalize that thought a little bit, or normalize the thoughts of death for them, sometimes people are more receptive then to saying, well, yeah, that's kind of the way I feel. And
For you, where do you draw the line with all of the experience and expertise you have on this topic, of when it's time to escalate your clinical response to it?
At 2 points. One, when they actually have a plan, or if they've had a history of suicidal behavior before, and this time they're kind of on the fence. And then I will still just say, well, you know what, let's get someone out here just to come do an assessment and talk a little further about it. Um, Sometimes that's all they need just to kind of keep themselves safe, is to have that other, like what they see as a higher level coming out. Even though I could do the same exact thing that the crisis team could do, um, my assessments are a little more in depth because I also have history that I've done a really thorough intake on that I can draw from. It's just having that other person come in that sometimes shifts that for them.
You talked about the difference between a suicide screening and a suicide assessment. What do you think is important for us to understand about the difference between those two and how we appropriately utilize those in session?
So the suicide screenings are, there are many of them. So the ASQ is one, and then QPR is one, and then there's the Columbia Suicide Rating Scale. So those are basically, you know, it'll say, it'll give you like 4 questions. The Columbia gives you 4 questions, yes or no questions. And then it says, if any of these are yes, then ask number 5, which is like directly about wanting to kill yourself. But it's not even that direct in a sense. So what if someone says no to all 4 questions, but you just kind of haven't hit on the right thing for them? So it's really, you know, listening to what they're saying and knowing that they're having that hopelessness or that despair or feeling that, you know, burdensome. A lot of people will come out and clearly say, I just feel like I'm a burden. So it's when you hear those things, and then it's asking a whole set of just much more in-depth questions leading into either your, you know, rating scale and also into your then safety plan and kind of where you go from that.
Review for us again those 3 components of Thomas Joiner's theory of interpersonal suicide risk. Please list those out again for our listeners so that we can really start to conceptualize this information this way.
So the first one is perceived burdensomeness. So whereas you feel like you're a burden, that you are just causing way too many problems for people, and that it would just be easier for everybody if you weren't here. It would be easier for your family, for your friends, for everybody else if you were not here. Then there was thwarted belongingness, where people just don't feel like they belong. I had a client who had absolutely no relatives, one friend who went to school with her, but she was kind of just as dysfunctional as my client. So she wasn't really a great support. And my client had a cat. That was it. And but she just felt like she was a burden, that nobody understood her, and that she felt like she was always just pushed aside, and that she didn't belong anywhere, and no one within any system. She was trying to go to school and to college, and they didn't understand her. And so those were those two things. And then when she started telling me about this one particular night that she had alcohol and pills and she was going to take them, when she hung up the phone with me, and she was even just thinking of hanging up the phone on me, was when I was able to actually convince her to call the crisis team, to have them, she was at home, to have them come assess her. And they did hospitalize her for 5 days or something. But it's when you start hearing those things about, well, why should I be here anyhow? Nobody cares. There's nobody here for me. I'm just a pain in the neck, even to the people at the school. And so those types of things. And then, so the last one is, what she had access to. So it's like access to means, and then the capability. It's like you have no reason to live. So you don't care that you're going to die. So you're ready to go and end your life.
What about individuals who have utilized non-fatal means? They've taken a bottle of vitamins, they have utilized some kind of method that wouldn't likely kill them, but has still indicated some suicidality there. So these are the folks that have not utilized a knife or a gun or something that we really think of as being lethal. What about those situations, and what do you recommend we keep in mind when addressing and managing those situations?
Yeah, it's really about the intent. So, yes, some things are more lethal than others, although taking a bottle of Tylenol could be just as lethal if it's not caught in time, right? But it could be, I've had, teens go and say to their parents, oh my God, I just took a bottle of Tylenol and now I regret what I did. So thankfully they're able to get to the hospital and able to get the care that they need. But a lot of times it's, more impulsive like that. So, but it doesn't matter. I mean, it's the intent of, do you want to die, or are you just trying to get someone to pay attention to you because there's no one there for you? And so, that will make a statement because you've tried everything else.
What are some other pieces of research about death by suicide that clinicians either may not know or may have heard myths or truths about? You mentioned about the likelihood of clinicians seeing someone who is suicidal in their work. What about specific diagnoses that are associated with suicidality? What diagnoses indicate death by suicide versus what we might call suicidal posturing?
Yeah, really interesting. So NAMI came out with some statistics recently showing that 50.4% of people who die by suicide do not have a mental health diagnosis. So that is a big myth. And if you talk to people, they're going to go, oh, the majority of people who die by suicide have mental health diagnosis, and they're bipolar, they're, schizophrenic, or they're, major depression with psychotic features. No. So that's really a myth. I think it's been a myth for a long time. And unfortunately, that definitely puts a stigma on mental health, and it puts a stigma on, the people who do attempt suicide and everything else. The other big myth is it's always been 1 in 6 people are affected for every one person's suicide, 6 people who are associated with that one person are affected by that person's death. Actually, I believe it's 154 people are affected by that person's death. So Julie Searle, who was the president of the American Association of Suicidology, she's out of University of Kentucky, did research on that exact thing. And as she talked about it a couple of years ago at the conference, and there was like a big web that she drew, and every person, another person knew, or another, kind of that whole 6 degrees of separation thing. So suicide really does affect so many more people than anybody ever thought it to be. That was a huge myth within the community.
And I imagine that the death of celebrities plays into this as well and impacts this dramatically. I've had clients bring up the deaths of Rob Williams, Kate Spade, Anthony Bourdain. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. And I think the fact that Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain died so close together, that was a huge time in the suicide community. But that's another thing. So the actual statistic of suicide contagion is only 5%. And that's not to say that people's risk of suicide don't go up, or that their thoughts of suicide don't go up. But the death by suicide is only 5%. There was recently, with 13 Reasons Why, now coming out with season 3, the American Association of Suicidology also has been very involved with Netflix in trying to help them understand why it is so critical that we don't glamorize or show people dying by suicide on TV or in the media. And that when someone does die by suicide, it is triggering for so many people when they hear how, or if they see how. So they worked with Netflix, and Netflix did take out of season 1 that ending of Hannah's death, which we're all just so grateful for. But there had been, in particular, with that show, an increase, a significant increase, more than just that 5% of death by suicide. And I don't know that that was necessarily a contagion effect to it, as much as it was so triggering for so many people to actually see it. So I don't think that if they didn't actually see it on TV, I don't think the effects would have been as great as they were.
I'm glad you bring up 13 Reasons Why. I certainly heard a lot about that from my clients and from their family members. I think there was part of us, maybe, and by us, I mean the clinical community, that was relieved about being able to talk about suicide, but then also the other side of it, of how it's influencing the behavior and the thinking by particularly adolescents about the availability or possibility of death by suicide.
Yeah. And yes, definitely. And unfortunately, it wasn't so realistic in so many ways. It portrayed, in particular, like the one thing that's coming to my mind right now is the counselor who was talking to Hannah at one point, and she kept giving all these signs, like clear signs that any school professional would pick up on. And he basically just blew her off. So that wasn't really realistic, but I do think that doesn't take away from the fact that a lot of not only just teens, but people feel that way. And some people feel that way in their work environments, or from, friends or colleagues or relatives. And so I think it was triggering in that. And yes, I also heard from, I think, every single one of my clients. And it did start a conversation. But the fact that they have continued, this show is also concerning. I don't know what season 3 is at all. And I didn't watch season 2. So, but it will be interesting to see kind of what now comes out of it with season 1 being re-released differently.
In schools, we've been seeing an increase in the conversation about recognizing suicidal behavior or listening for suicidal statements in friends. Teachers are receiving more training about how to recognize it in their students. What are your thoughts on those more formal school-based trainings?
Amazing. I wish that they had more. And actually, so I know you mentioned in the beginning, I'm the chair of the Youth Suicide Prevention Committee for AAS. Easier than saying American Association of Suicidology every time. So it's AAS. And one of the projects, actually a huge project we just worked on, we collaborated with Nationwide Children's Hospital Suicide Prevention Center in Columbus, Ohio, and the Boys and Girls Club of America in Columbus. And we created a program for them to work with their teens during the summer. And we're hoping that that will continue year through. It'll probably have to be changed up a little bit because of the depth of the program. I think it's 6 modules of each 90 minutes to 2 hours, all the way talking about from just bullying, family issues, safe adults to talk to, being okay with having the conversation, how do you talk about it, identifying it in your friends, actually having them do a safety plan, which we called Code Red. And it's they're actually going to be able to shrink it down to like a pocket-sized card for them so they can keep it in their pocket. And the other thing that I always suggest, even with just people that I do their safety plans, is take a screenshot of it. So you have it on your phone at all times, because realistically, you're not going to carry a piece of paper with you. And some people don't carry purses all the time or wallets. And but what we're hoping is that this program will then, I think right now it's set to launch next month. And then after that, it's going to hopefully launch a couple other cities in Ohio. Eventually, we'd like to spread it through Boys and Girls Clubs throughout the country. And our committee is going to start working on more programs like that to be able to go to schools and, different organizations and to be able to have that conversation, because the more you talk about it, the more stigma is reduced. So that's really what's key, and make it, more comfortable and not so taboo to have that conversation or to have those feelings.
When I was in high school, I remember a friend of mine calling and saying that he had been thinking of committing suicide. And I remember having no idea what to do. At that point in time, nobody talked about it. There was no education that I had ever received from the school or from anybody else for that matter about how to handle it if a friend was having any suicidal thoughts. It sounds like we're moving away from things being so taboo. While it's important to have this dialogue and continue the conversation about suicide, it's also important to refrain from glamorizing it, whether that be through television or movies or even through news stories. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, even in the written literature, there is a standard of media guidelines that American Association has put out for the media when reporting on suicide. And more we're finding that they're following those guidelines. And one of the big guidelines is do not disclose how the person died. Because again, like with Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, that could be so triggering for so many people. And so it really doesn't matter how they died. They died, and it's sad and it's tragic, but you don't need to know how. So yes, that is a big thing. And you're right, because when I was in high school, like eons before that, like in the late 70s, I also had a friend who was actually in a psychiatric hospital. And I remember going with this other friend of mine to go visit him. And I didn't really understand. I mean, I was 17 years old, but I did not really understand, like, what did that mean that he actually tried to kill himself? And why would he do that? I just knew he was depressed and he was sad and he had like a really bad home life. But I just had no clue, really no clue, until I was in college, I think, and then started, learning more about it and mental health and all of that. But nobody talked about it.
When we see clients who may not have any reported suicidal thoughts and they deny fantasizing about what life would be like if they weren't here, is it important to still bring up this topic for us to say, it's not uncommon for people to sometimes think about hurting or killing themselves? Is that going on for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I do is when someone has expressed any suicidal ideation, even if it's just on the very low end of those thoughts of death and just kind of not wanting to be here, I ask every single session, so where are you on your scale? And then they'll tell me a 3. I'm like, okay, what does that mean this week? Because a lot of clients, I have one 18-year-old who I've been seeing for about a year and a half, who comes in every single time. She's had multiple suicide attempts. She was in residential. She's doing awesome now and working and driving. And I'm so proud of her. But every time she comes in, she'll always say she's good. So I'll say, well, what does good mean? And good is usually never good. And then I'll ask her, so where are you on your scale? And she's like, her baseline is a 2. So she like does have thoughts, but she isn't going to act on them at this point. So it's really just to be cognizant of completely and continually monitoring it and making it okay for the client to be able to talk about it on a regular basis.
I know for a lot of us in our traineeships, it was so uncomfortable to ask about this, to bring it up in session. It was so hard to ask that question. You would get through your assessment, you'd hit the question, and then quickly or quietly say, have you ever had thoughts about killing yourself? Have you ever tried to kill yourself? And then move on. I think it sounds like it's important for us to still be having the conversation and model for clients that it's okay to bring this thing up, and that this is a topic that's fair game. We need to be talking about it.
Yes. And even more so, I'll give you a great example is it happened to me twice within a year. So last year I had some minor back surgery, and I was in, the admitting where you're already like dressed for surgery, IVs in hand, right, ready to go. And the nurse comes in asking you all these questions. Fine. A couple months ago, I was in an urgent care because I bruised some ribs, and same thing happened. I knew this time like what was coming. And the first time the woman's like, well, I just have to ask you some questions. So do you want your family to step out of the room? I'm like, no, absolutely not. It's fine. And so then she's like, okay, so is anybody harming you or hurting you? And they do screen for like what this nurse recently told me is like for trafficking and stuff. That's their big thing that they look for. And I said, no. And then she said, okay. And I'm like thinking, okay, here it comes. And she goes, so have you, and you could tell she was so uncomfortable. And she said, so have you had thoughts of wanting to harm yourself? And I said, no. I said, but can I ask you a question? She said, what? And I said, are you assessing for suicide? And she said, yes. Why? And I said, because you're not asking the question for suicide. And I explained what I do. And I explained, very, gently exactly why it is we need to ask directly. And I said, it's really important to ask that. And I said, it's so hard. I said, practice with your colleagues. Because when I actually do trainings, when they're live trainings, not online, I make people turn to each other and I make them ask each other like a gazillion times, have you thought about wanting to kill yourself? Do you feel like you want to kill yourself? Different ways, because it is so hard now, because I've done it so many times. I could ask it in my sleep and it's not a problem for me, but I know I'm not the norm. So yes, it is just so hard. So I would say practice with a friend, practice with a spouse, whatever. But that is, and the same thing happened with that second nurse when she asked the same thing. And they were both so grateful that I told them, and how to do it differently. So
how about suicide helplines? Knowing that there are now a number of services that you can call into or text into, how have you seen that play out in attempted suicide or actual death by suicide?
So there was another statistic also. I don't remember the exact number, but the majority of people will not call a hotline of those people who attempt suicide or die by suicide, but they have been to a medical professional. There was like a large portion, like 60 something percent had been to a medical professional within a month, and 34%, I think, had been within a week. So they are reaching out for help somehow, but same thing. I just continue to normalize it and I bring it up to everybody. And the one big thing is now they have crisis text line. And so you text 741-741 and you put the subject line, you can put help, hello, start, whatever, and they text you back. And it is so effective. And the people who volunteer are trained so thoroughly and they are so wonderful. And I was recently in Ohio for a family event. And unfortunately, there was a tragic death of a student, an elementary school student, by suicide. Just fluke that I was there. And my husband's cousin's a teacher and called to say, knowing that I was there, can I help? And so I went to go work with the staff and the kids. And that's the one thing that these kids thought was amazing was at first they were afraid to text. I said, well, let's do it together. So that's what I do with a lot of my clients, because I know that once they do it with me, they're not afraid. And so if I call the suicide hotline with them, I will tell them, hey, I just want to let you know I'm a therapist. This is a test call. I have a client sitting with me so that they'll feel more comfortable. And the same thing when we text crisis text line. When they answer, how can I help you? I'll say, oh, I'm a therapist. I'm with, some clients who have experienced death and suicide or who have had suicidal ideation, whatever it is. And I want to show them how your service works so they'll feel comfortable. And they have a full-on conversation with them, and it's awesome. So, that's what I would suggest is really trying to, do that with your clients to make them feel more comfortable, because that's going to increase the chance that they're going to use it. It's not going to be this foreign thing of like, oh yeah, the number to call or text.
I've had clients be positively impacted by these helplines. We here at Clearly Clinical actually donate to the Trevor Project, which is an LGBTQ plus youth suicide prevention hotline. I've personally seen from my clients how impactful a service like that can be. Going back to what you were saying about the gentleman that had jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, it seems like really an opportunity for people to connect with another human and perhaps start to feel that they are valued and that their feelings are important and that they're important.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And more and more. Crisis Text Line, I believe, is now in Canada. And if they're not already international, they're going international, I believe. But it really is a lifesaver for a lot of people. And sometimes people just need to know there's that connection or that someone there. That's it. And they're good. Well, they're not good maybe, but you know what I mean? Like, yeah, they definitely feel like they have a bit more hope that someone was there for them.
In this specialization, to go back to how it actually looks in our practices, what are some other things that we can be doing as mental health professionals, in addition to what you've already discussed today, to really help bridge the gap and address this phenomenon, to address suicidality?
I think really be able to find out what it is that your clients need. And, and especially in private practice, it's so important to be either in a consultation group or have a number of someone that you can call in case you do have something that you need to debrief. But I think that the more you speak with other professionals, you'll find they do things different ways, or they have different tools or techniques that they can use to be able to help. I think the more trainings you have, this is the other myth is, oh, I've already had one training in suicide risk assessment, or I've had one training in suicidal clients. I'm good.
Or I listen to one podcast.
Yeah, or I listen to one podcast for an hour. I've already done, this is my 5th podcast in, I don't know, 6-8 months. And every single one has been different. So there's always different information. And then I'm doing a series of webinars, such different information. And the fact that every year, the American Association of Suicidology, their numbers increase of people going to their conference. This year, we had, I think, almost 1,500 people come, whereas last year was maybe 1,100. There are always different topics and subjects and new research, and you can never learn enough. And kind of like what I always say to the clinicians that I supervise or the interns that I've had when they're in their master's programs is the day I stop learning is the day I need to get out of this field. So this in particular is truly a matter of life or death. And you can never get enough information on the subject as far as I'm concerned.
That leads me to one of my other questions, which I think is one of the harder things for us to talk about. What do we do to help take care of ourselves if we as clinicians have a client that dies by suicide?
You, number one, should be getting consultation around it clinically, and you should be going to see a therapist for yourself, for your own just grief, besides the fact that there might be countertransference, but just your own grief. And there are therapists also who specialize in seeing people, who have had grief or deaths or, suicide. And so those would be the therapists that I would reach out to. Or if you're already seeing your therapist, that's a perfect, thing. But aside from just having a client die by suicide, when you're working with clients in this field, period, but high risk clients, there's so much compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma that you need to have self-care. And therapy is self-care, because, you can so get caught up in this suicidal crisis process with them. So you really need to be able to seek out that help.
I've had clients who have divulged that they have a plan and they have means. And so our next step, of course, is to call the emergency response team. Then there's this big fracture in our relationship with that client. Of course, we can frame it by the fact that our primary job is to help keep the client safe and say, basically, I'm going to cross that bridge with you together. Whatever happens from now when I make this phone call, whether they take you for assessment or hospitalization or not, I'm going to cross that bridge with you. What other recommendations do you have about how to manage that after the fact, after we've called the emergency response team, and how to help heal that fracture with the client?
Yeah. The first thing is that I let them know they have every right to be angry, and they could be angry, and it's okay. Like, I'm not going to get upset that they're angry, because I think one of the things that happens is people in their lives don't let them get angry, or if they get angry, then they abandon them. And so these clients have a real fear of abandonment. But the other thing is to really talk to them about how this was such a compassionate thing on your part, because you do care and you do want to see them live. And that's, in truth, what they want to hear in the end, is that there is someone who cares. A lot of times, people think, oh, therapists are just there to do their job, and they're just there, for the money. And I can't tell you how many times I've had teens tell me that. You're here because my mom pays you. But the truth is, when you let them know that you genuinely care, then that helps to start repair that fracture. And you can let them know that it'll take time. It'll take time, for them to start to rebuild that trust. And that's okay. But you're going to still be here for them every step of the way, just like you were when you said, like, when you cross that bridge to make that difficult decision in the beginning.
The research shows that people who have attempted suicide previously are significantly more likely to attempt it again. How do we integrate that information when we hear from someone that they attempted suicide, say, 12 years ago?
That's really the key importance of such a detailed intake history. So much so that I go back to the mother's pregnancy, and people laugh at me. But I can't tell you how many times that's where that client's problem started. Clients are premature, or they have medical problems. The parent is an alcoholic that they're never going to tell you about. And so as you go through their entire history, and then you do find out that they had a previous attempt, you need to find out everything about that attempt. So, maybe that person's life has totally turned around. Maybe they were in an abusive relationship. Maybe they were married to a person that they, couldn't be. Maybe they were a teen living with a parent that was high conflict, and maybe like all of their circumstances have changed, but that doesn't mean that still wasn't a coping skill that they utilized before. So to be able to have all of that information at your hands and to have an honest conversation about it with them.
It seems like there are so many things for us to remember when it comes to appropriately assessing and then managing possible suicidality in clients. We can start by seeing a client and then their life situation changes. If we don't have a specialization in this, we might find ourselves kind of outside of our scope unexpectedly. So we might be seeing a client that's well within our scope when we first start working together, but something changes, and perhaps, say, 6 months into treatment, that person is now having suicidal thoughts, maybe gestures come up. To recap, in your eyes, we then seek consultation, we refer out or into a higher level of care like intensive outpatient or potentially even hospitalization or residential treatment, and we seek training. We don't know when someone who has been stable may transition out of that stability and need an appropriate response from us. Norine, I know you and I could sit and talk about this topic for quite a while. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise. What are some resources that our listeners can look for, like books, websites, trainings, and how can they get in touch with you?
So they can find me on my website at Norine VanderHooven, NoRineVanderHooven. It's a mouthful, .com. Or I also have a free Facebook group for suicide risk assessment for mental health professionals. And that's where people ask lots of great questions. I've been doing some webinars there. I'm going to be doing a course, 6-week course as well. So feel free to, request to join that. It's just called Suicide Risk Assessment for Mental Health Professionals. If you put it in Facebook, it will come right up. A great website is suicidality.org. That is the website for the American Association of Suicidology. And the other one is afsp.com, I believe it is. It's the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and they really focus on loss survivors, so people who have lost loved ones to suicide and how to support them. And both of those have great resources. And from there, they will give you a ton more resources.
Thank you again, Norine. We really appreciate you being here.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our 1-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.